Welcome back to the PolyTalksCast podcast. Today, we're diving deep into a period that continues to shape our world, the Cold War.
Yeah.
We've got your sources right here ready to uncover those hidden gems of knowledge.
Right.
That help us understand this era.
Yeah.
And, maybe even see how it's playing out today.
Absolutely. Well, let me introduce myself first. I'm the expert speaker on the Cold War today.
And I'm the host.
Yeah.
As always.
Yeah. So what's so fascinating about the Cold War is that it wasn't your typical boots on the ground conflict.
Okay.
So
you're saying it wasn't a battlefield with soldiers and tanks?
Exactly. It was more like a high stakes chess match played out on a global scale.
Oh.
The U.S. and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers at the time, were locked in this intense rivalry, but they never directly fought each other.
Okay.
It was a war of ideology, espionage, and influence.
Right.
They called it a Cold War for a reason.
Okay, so instead of bombs and bullets, they were battling with ideas and spies.
Precisely. They used propaganda to win hearts and minds.
Wow.
Spies to gather secrets. And they even backed other countries' wars to spread their influence. These were called proxy wars.
Okay.
And they were a key feature of the Cold War.
Proxy wars. That's where things get really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like they're fighting each other through someone else's conflict.
Exactly.
I remember reading about the Korean War.
Yeah.
In your sources. Was that a proxy war?
Absolutely. You had the U.S. supporting South Korea.
Oh, wow.
And the Soviet Union and China backing North Korea.
Yeah.
It became this battleground for their ideologies.
Okay.
But the superpowers themselves never went head to head.
That must have been so confusing for the people caught in the middle of those proxy wars.
Exactly.
It really highlights how the Cold War, even though it wasn't a hot war, still had a huge impact on people's lives all over the world.
Yeah. And speaking of impact, one of the most powerful images from that era comes from Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in 1946.
Right.
He talked about this metaphorical barrier dividing Europe between the communist East and the democratic West.
That Iron Curtain metaphor is so striking.
Yeah.
It really captures the sense of division that defined the Cold War.
It does.
And one event that always comes to mind when I think about that division is the Berlin airlift.
The Berlin airlift. Talk about a tense standoff.
Yeah.
In 1948,
Right.
the Soviets blockaded all land access to West Berlin.
Okay.
Essentially trying to starve it out and force the Western powers out.
So they literally cut off West Berlin from the rest of the world.
Yes. But the U.S. and its allies refused to give in.
Okay.
Instead, they launched this massive airlift operation, flying in supplies day and night for over a year.
Wow.
To keep West Berlin alive.
That's incredible.
Can you imagine the logistical challenge of supplying an entire city by air?
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
That must have been a truly incredible feat.
Yeah.
Of coordination and determination.
It certainly was. The Berlin airlift became a symbol of the West's resolve.
Right.
And a powerful reminder of just how high the stakes were during the Cold War.
Absolutely.
It also showed how willing they were to go to extreme lengths to protect their interests.
But with tensions so high, I have to ask, how close did we actually come to a full-blown nuclear war?
Right.
I mean, that's the ultimate fear during the Cold War, right?
It's a question that still haunts us today.
Yeah.
And the truth is, we came terrifyingly close during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
Okay.
The Soviets secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba.
Wow.
Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
90 miles? That's practically in America's backyard.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine the panic that must have caused.
It was a 13-day standoff that had the entire world on edge. Imagine two superpowers, both armed with nuclear weapons, staring each other down.
Oh, my God.
Each waiting for the other to blink.
Yeah.
It was the closest we've ever come to nuclear war.
It's almost hard to believe that cooler heads prevailed.
Yeah.
There must have been some intense diplomacy going on behind the scenes to avert disaster.
It was a masterclass in brinkmanship and negotiation, that's for sure.
Wow.
And it highlights just how fragile peace was during the Cold War.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about ideologies and territories.
Right.
It was about the potential for total annihilation.
You're absolutely right. That sense of impending doom must have been so heavy.
It was.
But it wasn't all doom and gloom, right? I mean, the Cold War also had this other side, this incredible competition that pushed both sides to achieve some amazing things, especially in technology.
You're talking about the space race, of course.
Yeah, it wasn't enough to compete on Earth.
Right.
They took the rivalry to space. It's like they said, okay, you built a big bomb, well, we're going to launch a man into space.
Right.
It seems like such a wild response in hindsight, but it makes sense in the context of the Cold War.
Exactly. And it led to some truly groundbreaking achievements. The Soviets shocked the world with the launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite in 1957.
Wow.
That was a huge wake-up call for the U.S.
Right.
And it basically kickstarted the space race.
Sputnik really captured the world's imagination, didn't it?
It did.
I mean, suddenly there was this man-made object orbiting the Earth.
Yeah.
And it belonged to the Soviets.
It was a major propaganda victory for them.
Wow.
And it fueled the U.S. to pour resources into their space program, culminating in the Apollo 11 mission and Neil Armstrong's famous first steps on the moon in 1969.
Talk about a giant leap for mankind.
Right.
It's amazing to think that this Cold War rivalry, which was so terrifying in many ways, also led to these incredible scientific and technological advancements.
It's a strange paradox, isn't it?
It is. This constant tension and competition fueled innovation.
Right.
But it also kept the world on a nice edge.
And it wasn't just about space exploration.
Right.
This rivalry touched every aspect of life, didn't it?
Absolutely.
From everyday routines to the books we read and the movies we watched.
Yeah.
I remember reading about duck and cover drills.
Oh, yeah.
In one of your sources.
The fear of nuclear war was so pervasive that school children in the U.S. practiced these drills.
Wow.
Where they would duck under their desks and cover their heads in case of an attack.
Oh, my gosh.
It's hard to imagine that level of anxiety being a part of everyday life.
It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it?
It does.
But those drills weren't the only way the Cold War crept into everyday life.
Right.
It also had a huge impact on popular culture, right?
Absolutely. The Cold War seeped into everything from fashion and music to literature and film.
Right.
Spy novels like James Bond became bestsellers.
And movies like Dr. Strangelove satirized the absurdities of the nuclear arms race.
Wow.
The anxieties and uncertainties of the time were reflected in art music and every form of creative expression.
It's fascinating how this global conflict managed to weave itself into the very fabric of society. But eventually, this seemingly unbreakable conflict came to an end.
Right.
So what happened?
Yeah.
What caused this Iron Curtain to finally fall?
Well, you know, nothing lasts forever, right? Even an intense rivalry like the Cold War. And believe it or not, economics played a huge role in its eventual collapse.
Really? Money problems brought down a superpower? I wouldn't have guessed that. Tell me more.
Think about it. The Soviet system was all about central control. They pumped tons of resources into heavy industry and the military, but they neglected things like consumer goods and innovation. The economy just couldn't keep up, especially when compared to the U.S., which had a much more diverse and adaptable system.
So it's like they were running a marathon with one leg tied behind their back. They just couldn't sustain that level of spending without something giving way.
Exactly. And that economic strain started creating cracks in the foundation. People wanted more. They wanted better living conditions, more freedom, and that desire for change started bubbling up from within.
So it wasn't just about the U.S. outspending them. It was also about the Soviet people themselves demanding a different way of life.
Precisely. And that's where Mikhail Gorbachev comes in. He became the leader of the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s, and even he recognized that things needed to change. He introduced these policies called Glasnost and Perestroika, which were aimed at reforming the system.
I remember reading about those terms in the sources you sent, but to be honest, they always kind of went over my head. Can you break those down for me in plain English?
Of course, Glasnost basically means openness. Gorbachev wanted to loosen the grip of censorship and allow people to speak more freely, to share their ideas and criticisms of the government. It was a pretty radical idea for the Soviet Union.
So it's like they were cracking open a window after decades of living in a tightly sealed room.
Yeah.
No wonder that caused some turbulence.
Exactly. And then you had Perestroika, which means restructuring. This was all about economic reforms, trying to introduce some free market principles and make the system more efficient.
It sounds like Gorbachev was trying to modernize the Soviet Union, bring it into the 20th century, so to speak.
That was the idea, but it's kind of like trying to fix a crumbling building with a fresh coat of paint. The problems ran too deep. And what's fascinating is that those reforms, while well-intentioned, actually backfired in a way.
Wait, backfired? So I thought they were supposed to be making things better.
Well, they did in some ways, but they also unintentionally unleashed a chain reaction that ultimately led to the Soviet Union's demise.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What happened?
By loosening restrictions and allowing more freedom of expression, Gorbachev inadvertently gave people a voice, and they used it to demand even more change. The cracks in the system widened, and pretty soon those cracks turned into fissures, especially in the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe.
So it's like those reforms created a ripple effect that spread throughout the Soviet bloc.
Exactly. People saw what was happening in Moscow, and they started demanding similar reforms in their own countries. They wanted more autonomy, more freedom, more say in their own destinies. And all of this culminated in what many consider the symbolic end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989.
The Berlin Wall. Those images of people chipping away at it, celebrating on top of it, are so powerful. It really does feel like a pivotal moment in history.
It was a watershed moment. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall had been the physical embodiment of the Iron Curtain, dividing East and West Berlin, dividing families and friends, dividing ideologies. And when it came down, it felt like the world was shifting on its axis.
I can only imagine what it must have felt like to witness that event. It must have been exhilarating and terrifying all at the same time.
It was a moment of both celebration and uncertainty, and it signaled the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. Just a couple of years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, officially marking the end of the Cold War.
Wow, what a journey. From Churchill's Iron Curtain speech to the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's amazing how this global rivalry played out over nearly half a century, impacting everything from political ideologies to scientific advancements to popular culture. It's incredible to think that we lived through such a pivotal time in history.
Right.
You know, the Cold War was about so much more than just politics and military power.
Right.
It really shaped the way we think about the world.
Absolutely.
Even today.
You're absolutely right. The Cold War might be over.
Okay.
But its legacy is still very much alive. It continues to influence global politics, international relations, even the way we view technology and power.
So it's not just a dusty chapter in a history book.
Nope.
We're still feeling the ripples of that conflict.
Definitely. Many of the alliances and rivalries we see playing out on the world stage today have roots in the Cold War.
Okay.
Think about NATO, for example. It was formed in 1949, as a direct response to the Soviet threat. And even though the Soviet Union is gone, NATO is still going strong, adapting to new challenges and security concerns.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It shows how deeply the Cold War shaped the global landscape.
It did.
We're essentially still operating within a system that was created during that era.
Exactly. And it's not just about political alliances.
Okay.
The Cold War also had a profound impact on the way we think about technology and innovation. Remember the space race? It wasn't just about getting to the moon. It was about proving technological superiority.
It's like they were saying, my rocket is bigger than yours.
Exactly.
But in a way, that competition was also a catalyst for progress, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The Cold War pushed both the U.S. and the Soviet Union to invest heavily in research and development, which led to breakthroughs in fields like aerospace, computing, and even material science. Those advancements continue to benefit us today.
It's fascinating how this rivalry, which was so destructive in many ways, also had this unintended consequence of accelerating technological progress.
It's a reminder that history is full of complexities and contradictions.
It is.
And it's why it's so important to study the past.
Right.
Not just to understand where we came from, but also to navigate the challenges of the present and the future.
You know, it's kind of mind-blowing to think that we're still grappling with the legacy of a conflict that officially ended over 3 decades ago.
I know.
It makes you wonder what future historians will say about our time.
That's a great question. I think they'll look back at this period as one of transition and uncertainty, a time when the old world order was crumbling.
Right.
And a new one was struggling to take shape. And they might even draw parallels to the Cold War as we see new power dynamics emerging and technological competition heating up.
It's like we're living through a sequel to the Cold War, but with new players and new technologies.
Perhaps. But one thing is for sure, understanding the Cold War with all its complexities and nuances can provide us with valuable insights into the challenges we face today. It's a reminder that history doesn't just repeat itself, it rhymes.
Well, I think it's safe to say that we've all learned a lot about the Cold War today, thanks to your incredible insights and the fascinating sources you provided. It's been a truly enlightening journey.
It's been a pleasure sharing this deep dive with you and our listener. It's always fascinating to revisit these pivotal moments in history and see how they continue to shape our world.
And a huge thank you to you, our listener, for sending us these thought-provoking sources. We hope this deep dive has given you a fresh perspective on the Cold War and maybe even sparked some new questions.
And if this conversation has piqued your interest, we encourage you to continue exploring this fascinating period. There's always more to learn, more connections to discover, and more insights to be gained.
That's right. History is full of surprises, and the more we dig, the more we realize how interconnected everything is.
And who knows, maybe by understanding the past, we can create a better future.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks again for joining us on this deep dive into the Cold War. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, PolyTalksCast, for more fascinating explorations of history, science, culture, and all things that make us go, that's interesting.
Until next time, stay curious